Have you ever wondered how a professional sports franchise could risk its entire future on a single handshake, only to watch their massive, multi-million-dollar empire crumble from the inside out? Today, we are pulling back the curtain on one of the most fiercely guarded secrets in professional basketball history. We are talking about Pervis Ellison. He was supposed to be the ultimate savior, the generational franchise player who would unquestionably dominate the league for the next decade. But behind the blinding flashbulbs and the roaring applause, a completely different, much darker reality was being concealed from the unsuspecting public. According to the official league archives, on June 27, 1989, the Sacramento Kings confidently selected Pervis Ellison as the absolute first overall pick. In doing so, they consciously passed on future Hall of Famers like Shawn Kemp and Tim Hardaway. And right here, a massive, uncomfortable question arises. Why did an entire highly paid scouting department ignore the glaring red flags that were already whispering through the back hallways of the college arenas? Based on the draft combine reports from that exact year, scouts were completely mesmerized by his incredible wingspan and his overwhelming college dominance. They bought heavily into the illusion of the flawless player. But was it really just an innocent collective mistake? Or did someone in the front office deliberately bury the inconvenient truth just to secure their own lucrative bonus? The television cameras captured the commissioner shaking Pervis Ellison's hand in June of 1989, cementing a historic, life-changing deal. Everyone was smiling brightly, and the local press immediately declared it a phenomenal victory for Sacramento. Yet, while the executives enthusiastically popped champagne in the VIP suites, no one sitting in that packed auditorium had any idea that deeply hidden within his private medical charts lay a ticking time bomb, ready to detonate and destroy everything they had built. To truly understand the sheer magnitude of this monumental collapse, we have to rewind the tape back to the very moment this grand illusion was originally born. Long before the devastating scandals, the bitter disappointments, and the mocking headlines, Pervis Ellison was essentially treated like an untouchable basketball deity. As detailed extensively in collegiate sports chronicles from that specific era, the absolute foundation of his immaculate reputation was cemented on March 31, 1986. On that exact night, he led his university team all the way to the national championship, performing with an icy, supernatural calmness that completely defied his young age. That specific performance earned him the incredibly iconic nickname, Never Nervous Pervis. But let us look much closer at the surviving documents. Historical athletic registries officially confirm he became only the second freshman in the entire decades-long history of the tournament to be awarded the title of Most Outstanding Player. And this is exactly where the dangerous trap finally snapped shut. Did this single, undeniably glorious night completely blind the professional general managers for years to come? It genuinely seems the top executives were so thoroughly enchanted by the romantic narrative of a stoic young boy who never felt pressure that they completely stopped analyzing his actual physical vulnerabilities. They saw a silent warrior who could handle any imaginable amount of stress, aggressively ignoring the subtle, creeping signs of physical wear and tear that were already beginning to surface behind closed doors. The loyal fans worshipped his absolute composure, firmly believing they were witnessing the dawn of an unbreakable superstar. But that exact same unbreakable exterior, that legendary calm under immense pressure, would soon transform into the very weapon used against him, triggering the most brutal and ruthless public backlash the city of Sacramento had ever witnessed. Behind heavily closed doors, far away from the cheering fans and the wildly optimistic newspaper headlines, the Sacramento front office was playing a very dangerous high-stakes game. The fateful decision to draft Pervis Ellison was not just a simple basketball move. It was a desperate, calculated gamble orchestrated by powerful men who urgently needed a miracle. According to the memoirs of rival club managers published many years later, the internal private discussions during the scorching summer of 1989 were incredibly tense. Some highly seasoned veteran scouts had already started whispering nervously about his fragile frame, quietly raising serious concerns that his body might simply not endure the grueling, physically punishing 82-game professional schedule. But those crucial warnings were conveniently and swiftly silenced. Why did they ignore the experts? Sports aggregators officially show that Pervis Ellison averaged exactly 15.8 points per game during his celebrated college career. That specific, undeniable number quickly became a golden shield for the nervous executives. They used that exact statistic repeatedly to justify their massive financial commitment, effectively shutting down any internal dissent or hesitation. But who actually pushed this risky deal through, deliberately ignoring the quiet, persistent alarms? The heavy responsibility fell squarely on the broad shoulders of legendary figures running the Kings at that specific time, who desperately needed a massive marketing triumph to sell season tickets. They confidently sold the city a beautiful dream, carefully packaging a physically compromised young man as the ultimate, flawless basketball savior. The wealthy owners happily signed the massive, life-altering checks, completely convinced they had finally secured their golden ticket to the championships. They had absolutely no suspicion that, by the time the October training camp finally rolled around, their shiny, multi-million-dollar investment would suddenly trigger its very first, undeniable signal of a catastrophic physical breakdown. As the crisp autumn air settled over California in 1989, the golden dream of Sacramento began to quietly fracture behind the heavily closed doors of their private training facility. The highly anticipated rookie was suddenly nowhere to be found on the active roster. According to the daily sports newspaper reports from the fall of 1989, Pervis Ellison mysteriously missed the vast majority of the preseason matchups. The team's public relations department aggressively spun the narrative, issuing carefully worded statements about minor tweaks and routine precautions. But what exactly were they hiding from the fans who had just purchased thousands of expensive season tickets? The young star himself retreated into complete silence, wearing street clothes on the bench while his new team struggled on the hardwood. If we look closely at the official league protocols from that exact period, a staggering truth emerges. Out of a possible 82 regular season games, he managed to step onto the court for a mere 34. And right here, a massive investigation takes a sharp turn. How could the absolute number one pick in the entire draft, a player vetted by dozens of highly paid medical professionals, suddenly break down before his professional career even truly began? Some veteran journalists noted in their columns that the organization was desperately trying to mask the severity of his physical deterioration to avoid a massive public relations disaster. They essentially trapped him in a cycle of absolute secrecy, hoping a miraculous recovery would somehow save their own lucrative jobs. The silence from the rookie only fueled the growing paranoia within the front office. And while the official spokespeople stubbornly repeated their rehearsed lines about a slight sprain, deep inside the locker room, the massive financial figures of his guaranteed salary began to quickly surface, causing the veteran players to slowly clench their fists in absolute frustration. The toxic atmosphere inside the Sacramento Kings facility quickly escalated from quiet concern to outright, undeniable hostility. Imagine being a seasoned professional, putting your physical body on the line every single night, only to watch a rookie continuously sit on the sidelines draped in expensive designer suits. Based on the revealing interviews of former teammates conducted years later, the internal dynamics during the 1989 to 1990 season were incredibly explosive. The veteran players were essentially carrying the entire burden, while the supposed savior of the franchise contributed absolutely nothing of value. This was not merely about a team losing basketball games. This was about deeply personal pride and substantial amounts of money. According to the financial reports and contract leaks from that specific era, the massive guaranteed salary of Pervis Ellison created an agonizing financial imbalance within the team roster. He was earning significantly more than the battle-tested veterans who were actually breaking a sweat. And this is the exact moment the dark whispers began circulating. Why did a player with a supposedly minor injury need months of rest while earning millions of dollars? In the reports from seasoned locker room insiders, it was noted that several players actively accused him of essentially faking the severity of his pain. They firmly believed he lacked the heart and the sheer grit required to battle through adversity in the tough professional ranks. The once celebrated stoicism that originally earned him the Never Nervous moniker was now being weaponized against him. The local media heavily painted him as a detached, overpaid prima donna who simply refused to fight for the city's jersey. The heavy tension finally reached an absolute boiling point in the spring of 1990, when the desperate management realized one chilling fact. They urgently needed to dump their golden boy before his heavily inflated trade value plummeted to absolutely zero. In the ruthless, high-stakes business of professional sports, admitting a colossal scouting mistake usually costs a general manager their highly lucrative career. So, how do you quietly dispose of a severely damaged #1 overall pick without sparking a massive riot among your own loyal fan base? You orchestrate a complex, multi-team trade that looks like a strategic masterclass on television, but secretly operates as a desperate rescue mission behind the scenes. According to the official documents released by the league's transfer committee, the monumental deal officially took place in June of 1990. In a truly stunning, unprecedented move, the Sacramento Kings shipped Pervis Ellison completely across the country to the Washington Bullets after only a single disastrous season. But why was this massive transaction executed with such frantic speed? Based on the public materials and newspaper columns from that exact month, the trade involved multiple established, veteran players, effectively acting as a brilliant smokescreen to mask Sacramento's absolute internal panic. The executives desperately needed the public to focus heavily on the incoming talent rather than the embarrassing reality that they were actively dumping their most prized asset for pennies on the dollar. The entire sports industry was completely paralyzed by the sudden news. It was virtually unheard of for a franchise to simply abandon a top selection so unbelievably quickly. Reporters heavily scrutinized the deal, noting that the executives essentially threw away years of painful rebuilding just to escape the terrible public relations nightmare they had carefully created. It initially seemed like the nation's capital would finally offer the embattled star a clean, much-needed fresh start, away from the intense scrutiny of California. Yet, the confidential medical file that was quietly faxed directly to the Washington front office that very same week was hiding a deeply alarming, dark trend that was about to explode. Relocating to the nation's capital was heavily promoted as the ultimate redemption story for a battered young athlete who desperately needed to escape the toxic environment of California. The Washington Bullets proudly introduced Pervis Ellison to their devoted fan base, promising that a simple change of scenery would magically heal his deeply concerning physical ailments. And for a brief, incredibly deceptive moment, it actually seemed like the brilliant executives had orchestrated a massive steal. According to the deeply detailed statistical archives of the league, during the 1990 to 1991 season, his scoring average quietly climbed to 10.4 points per game. But here is where the true investigative questions begin to surface. Was this genuine progress or simply a carefully managed illusion orchestrated by a desperate coaching staff? In the internal tactical reports referenced heavily by local sports beat writers, it was clearly noted that the Washington coaches drastically altered their entire defensive and offensive schemes specifically to protect his alarmingly fragile frame. They essentially hit him on the floor, strictly limiting his explosive movements to prevent another catastrophic breakdown. The official league protocols reveal a seemingly miraculous statistic. He actually played in 76 games that year, which stood as an absolute record of reliability for the supposedly broken big man. How did a player labeled as hopelessly fragile suddenly transform into a reliable Iron Man? Was it cutting-edge medical treatment, or were they simply masking his pain to justify the massive trade? The loud, aggressive critics from Sacramento momentarily fell completely silent, genuinely assuming the young man had finally matured into a solid professional. But a truly supernatural, completely unexplainable statistical explosion was waiting to shock the entire basketball world exactly 1 year later. If you closely examine the long, complicated history of professional sports, there are certain individual campaigns that defy all logical, medical, and athletic explanation. The 1991 to 1992 season is the absolute masterpiece of the Pervis Ellison puzzle. Seemingly out of nowhere, he transformed into an unstoppable, dominant force that completely terrorized opposing defenses across the country. Based on the official sports chronicles from that specific era, he delivered staggering averages of exactly 20 points and 11.2 rebounds per game. He looked like the flawless, generational superstar Sacramento had originally dreamed of drafting. In the spring of 1992, according to the official league press releases, he was proudly awarded the prestigious Most Improved Player trophy. But when millions of dollars are on the line, nothing is ever quite as magical as it appears on television. In the deeply cynical columns published by financial sports journalists of the time, serious suspicions were raised about the suspicious timing of this magnificent physical peak. Why did this miraculous athletic resurgence align so perfectly with the looming expiration of his rookie contract? Did he suddenly learn how to play, or did he deliberately push his damaged body far beyond its absolute limits just to secure a massive payday? In the locker room, interviews later analyzed by sports historians, some individuals quietly questioned if he was essentially mortgaging his future health for a single, lucrative season. He successfully secured his elite status and guaranteed his future millions, entirely fooling the general managers of the league. However, the truly brutal and irreversible physical price for that single golden trophy became terrifyingly obvious to the Washington medical staff by the autumn of 1992. The tragic reality of professional basketball is that human joints and delicate ligaments do not care about prestigious trophies or multi-million-dollar contracts. The staggering physical toll of his magnificent breakout season immediately demanded a devastating repayment. The beautiful illusion of a perfectly healthy franchise center shattered completely, plunging the organization into an absolute medical nightmare. According to the official team rosters and game logs, during the 1992 to 1993 season, his availability aggressively plummeted to a mere 49 games. The dominant player who had just shocked the world was suddenly reduced to a limping, agonizing shadow of himself. But what exactly was happening behind the heavily guarded doors of the trainer's room? In the private medical reports heavily cited by specialized sports publications of that decade, doctors detailed a terrifying, chronic deterioration of his knees and the delicate joints in his toes. These were not the types of injuries that could be magically cured by a simple surgery or a few weeks of rest. His actual structural foundation was crumbling. The press heavily scrutinized his painful attempts to perform on the court. In the investigative articles from that brutal winter, journalists described a grim routine of constant painkillers and highly aggressive injections administered just to get him into his uniform. How long can a towering human frame endure that heavy chemical mask before it completely and permanently shatters? The Washington executives stared in absolute horror at the mounting medical bills and his agonizingly slow recoveries. They realized they had bought high on a player whose body was rapidly betraying him. Yet the absolute most devastating and deeply humiliating blow to Pervis Ellison was not going to come from a frustrated orthopedic surgeon, but from an incredibly cruel insult delivered directly by his own peers. When a professional athlete completely loses their physical ability to perform, the fans are usually the very first to turn their backs. But when the absolute harshest, most deeply humiliating mockery comes directly from your own colleagues, it leaves a permanent, irreversible stain on your entire legacy. For years, Pervis Ellison had proudly worn the iconic moniker of Never Nervous, a brilliant title that essentially shielded him from the immense pressure of the professional basketball world. However, as his heavily damaged knees repeatedly forced him back into civilian clothing on the sidelines, the whispering in the sports media suddenly transformed into a roaring, venomous joke. Based on the surviving transcripts of highly popular sports television broadcasts from that specific era, a completely new, devastatingly cruel phrase was officially coined. It was during these heavily watched telecasts that a prominent figure, often attributed to the famously outspoken Danny Ainge, publicly branded him with the highly toxic title of out-of-service Pervis. And right here, a massive, incredibly uncomfortable question instantly arises. How does a former #1 overall draft pick psychologically survive being openly mocked by the exact same fraternity he is supposed to belong to? If you look closely at the official playing records for the 1993 to 1994 season, the cold, hard statistics validate the harsh insult. According to the league data, he managed to step onto the hardwood for a mere 47 games that entire year. The press completely weaponized his magnificent college reputation, violently twisting his stoic demeanor into a massive public relations disaster. Journalists aggressively wrote that his legendary calmness was simply a mask for absolute indifference. As the vicious mockery echoed through the national media, it became painfully obvious that the Washington front office would absolutely never let him forget this profound professional humiliation. But just when it deeply seemed his heavily damaged career was entirely over, a historically legendary franchise suddenly appeared on the horizon, ready to offer a financial contract so incredibly bizarre that sports analysts still vigorously debate its existence today. Why would a historically massive, incredibly prestigious organization like the Boston Celtics willingly throw an absolute mountain of guaranteed cash at a severely compromised, constantly injured center? This specific decision remains one of the greatest, deeply perplexing mysteries of the entire 1990s. In the sweltering summer of 1994, the basketball world was completely stunned by a sudden, massive announcement. According to the official materials released during the heavily attended club press conferences, Pervis Ellison confidently signed a brand new, highly lucrative agreement with the Celtics as a highly sought-after free agent. But what exactly was happening behind the closed doors of the executive suites? Based on the detailed financial reports widely circulated in the major sports newspapers of that exact month, the stated financial sum of the contract was absolutely astronomical for a player possessing completely ruined knees. And this is exactly where the investigative trail gets incredibly suspicious. How did his aggressive representation essentially hypnotize the seasoned Boston management into believing he was completely healed? In the investigative articles analyzing this baffling transaction, experts firmly noted that his inner circle produced deeply reassuring, yet highly questionable, medical evaluations promising a full, spectacular, athletic resurrection. The legendary executives desperately wanted to believe the magnificent illusion, eagerly hoping to capture lightning in a bottle and revive their struggling empire. The loyal, incredibly passionate fans wrapped in green joyfully celebrated the monumental signing in the streets, genuinely praying for a miraculous return to his former glory. However, the intoxicating champagne of that summer celebration would rapidly turn into bitter, unpalatable poison. Because when the highly respected Boston medical staff finally conducted their very first, absolutely rigorous independent physical examination in August of 1994, a terrifying, heavy silence instantly fell over the entire front office. The devastating reality of an incredibly bad investment usually reveals itself slowly, but for the Boston front office, the absolute catastrophe materialized before a single regular season ticket was even punched. The highly touted, multi-million-dollar savior was completely broken before he could even properly lace up his iconic green sneakers. According to the deeply critical articles splashed across the front pages of the major Boston newspapers, the headlines viciously screamed about discarded money and absolute managerial incompetence. He suffered a mysterious, deeply debilitating physical setback before the official games even commenced, permanently casting a dark, heavy shadow over the entire organization. If we dive directly into the official league archives for the 1994 to 1995 season, a profoundly disturbing picture immediately emerges. The records formally indicate that he technically appeared in exactly 55 matchups. However, his actual time spent contributing on the polished hardwood was critically, almost embarrassingly low. And here, a fascinating, highly contentious financial question demands an immediate answer. How many thousands of guaranteed dollars was the franchise literally burning for every single minute he spent wearing a luxurious tailored suit at the absolute end of the substitute bench? Based on the furious reports from insider journalists, the franchise executives were privately tearing their hair out, staring at a massive financial black hole that was rapidly draining their precious resources. He became an incredibly expensive ghost, haunting the locker room while the rest of the struggling roster fought desperate battles without him. And just while the panicked team lawyers were actively hunting for obscure, hidden legal loopholes to immediately terminate this incredibly oppressive financial agreement, the embattled basketball player suddenly made a highly controversial move that completely infuriated the entire metropolitan area. The most terrifying phase of any prolonged athletic collapse is the exact moment when the physical pain silently morphs into a deeply toxic psychological war. When the expensive medical treatments repeatedly fail to produce any tangible results, the whispered doubts inevitably begin to echo through the empty corridors of the training facility. According to the deeply revealing insider reports circulating vigorously during the mid-90s, the highly respected club doctors actively began to mistrust the constant, deeply vague complaints originating from their expensive star. It was no longer just about torn ligaments or bone bruises. It became a massive, highly uncomfortable psychological standoff inside the Boston medical facilities. If we carefully examine the official database of the league, the numbers paint an absolutely horrifying, undeniable picture of professional stagnation. Over the span of 3 excruciatingly long seasons, Pervis Ellison participated in a grand total of exactly 68 games. And this precise statistical anchor immediately triggers a massive, investigative red flag. How can a fully grown, world-class athlete simply vanish for months on end without a catastrophic, career-ending diagnosis? As the frustrated sports columnists repeatedly noted in their weekly reports, the panicked management even attempted to secretly hire independent outside medical specialists to accurately evaluate his true, hidden physical condition. They desperately wanted to know if Pervis Ellison was genuinely a tragic victim of genetic bad luck, or a brilliant, highly calculated manipulator simply collecting massive, guaranteed paychecks while safely hiding behind the trainer's table. The head coaches continuously rotated through the revolving door of the struggling franchise, and the legendary Boston Empire rapidly descended into a dark, unprecedented crisis. But the absolute breaking point, the exact moment that permanently destroyed his fragile reputation even among his most fiercely loyal, forgiving supporters, occurred during a highly controversial, deeply fateful stretch of games in 1997. The absolute darkest, most emotionally crushing aspect of a massive professional downfall is not the physical deterioration itself, but the suffocating, impenetrable loneliness that aggressively follows. While the battered, heavily bruised roster of the Boston Celtics fought desperate, exhausting battles on the polished hardwood every single night, Pervis Ellison became a total, completely isolated phantom, lingering in the sterile shadows of the rehabilitation rooms. According to the deeply critical publications penned by veteran sports columnists during the deeply troubled 1997 to 1998 season, his overall engagement with the actual active team plummeted to an absolute, historic anti-record. He was technically on the highly lucrative payroll, but he was completely, permanently divorced from the actual brotherhood of the competitive locker room. And right here, we must ask the most damning, uncomfortable question of his entire tenure in Massachusetts. Why did absolutely no one, not a single veteran teammate or ambitious young rookie, ever publicly step forward to firmly defend his heavily battered honor in the ruthless local press? If you closely analyze the deeply controversial, entirely anonymous quotes extracted from Boston players during that exact period, a highly toxic narrative immediately emerges. In the sports pages, they bitterly spoke about a specific unnamed guy sitting comfortably on the sidelines who simply receives massive guaranteed checks, while the rest of them literally bleed for the iconic green uniform. The silent, heavy protest of his peers completely shattered whatever remaining confidence the front office possessed. The wealthy owners finally realized that keeping this incredibly expensive, highly polarizing figure around was actively destroying the very soul of their legendary franchise. By the time the 1998 season concluded, the deeply exhausted Boston executives finally finalized a radical, highly aggressive legal strategy that was specifically designed to violently rip this agonizing financial burden off their books once and for all. Removing a massive, fully guaranteed contract from a professional sports organization is never a simple, quiet procedure. It is a highly complex, incredibly messy, legal divorce. The unceremonious, deeply humiliating departure of Pervis Ellison from the Boston Celtics was masterfully orchestrated behind a thick curtain of carefully drafted corporate jargon. According to the official legal summaries quietly filed with the Central League office, the historic franchise finally, officially severed all professional ties with the embattled center, permanently ending the most frustrating chapter of their modern history. The local press corps ruthlessly framed the sudden departure not as a tragic athletic loss, but as a monumental, deeply necessary financial liberation. And when you actually crunch the specific numbers hidden within the public salary ledgers, the true agonizing scale of the disaster becomes undeniably clear. Based on the widely published financial statistics of his final guaranteed years, Pervis Ellison smoothly accumulated millions of dollars while simultaneously registering an absolute, historically minimal amount of actual points on the basketball court. The contrast between his exploding bank account and his completely evaporated on-court production was absolutely staggering. How many potential championships, how many magnificent playoff runs were entirely sacrificed simply because the front office was permanently paralyzed by this catastrophic financial miscalculation? The deeply cynical sports analysts proudly declared that his highly controversial, deeply debated professional career was now officially, permanently buried under a mountain of medical tape and discarded, incredibly expensive contracts. Most dedicated fans genuinely assumed the dramatic, highly toxic saga of the man they viciously called out-of-service Pervis was entirely finished. But in the unpredictable autumn of the year 2000, a mysterious, highly desperate executive suddenly stepped out of the shadows, ready to offer him one final, completely shocking chance at ultimate redemption. In October of the year 2000, the Seattle Supersonics front office made a deeply desperate, highly criticized move that sent massive shockwaves through the entire professional sports landscape. They inexplicably signed the heavily damaged veteran to a brand new professional contract. According to the official agency releases quietly distributed to the sports press that exact month, the wealthy executive somehow convinced themselves that his highly experienced presence would magically heal his completely ruined knees. But why would a fiercely competitive, championship-chasing franchise willingly gamble their massive budget on a physical ghost. In the deeply investigative analyses published by local Seattle beat writers, it was noted that the general manager was desperately trying to secure a cheap, experienced center, completely and aggressively ignoring the massive, blinding medical red flags waving furiously from his disastrous tenure in Boston. But the brutal, unforgiving reality of the professional hardwood cannot be fooled by highly optimistic press conferences or clever marketing campaigns. Based on the final official league extract of his deeply controversial career, Pervis Ellison managed to physically endure exactly 9 total games for his brand-new team. 9 completely agonizing, entirely forgettable appearances on the court. And right here, a massive question hangs heavily in the air. How could a former absolute #1 overall draft pick, a legendary collegiate player once destined to rule the entire league, allow his grand professional finale to be so incredibly brief and devastatingly hollow? His incredibly fragile body finally unequivocally surrendered to the heavy, brutal toll of a decade filled with constant surgeries and aggressive medical interventions. And directly after those excruciating 9 games, according to the deeply embedded locker room insiders of the time, he slowly walked into the private, secluded office of his head coach. In that quiet room, he delivered a final, unavoidable statement that meant only one thing. The highly scrutinized, multi-million-dollar athletic illusion spanning 11 long years was officially, permanently terminated. When the heavy dust finally settled on his deeply frustrating, highly debated athletic journey, the furious sports economists and deeply cynical columnists immediately began calculating the absolute, staggering financial damage. Just how much money did the terrified league executives willingly pay for a decade of expensive hospital beds and beautifully tailored sideline suits? According to the publicly available, incredibly detailed salary ledgers carefully preserved from that specific era, the total guaranteed career earnings of Pervis Ellison hovered right around an astonishing $17 million. $17 million heavily protected dollars handed over to a player who spent the vast majority of his absolute prime years hopelessly trapped in the sterile confines of the rehabilitation room. Based on the aggressive, highly critical financial breakdowns published in major sports magazines at the turn of the century. If you specifically divide his massive fortune by the actual number of official games he played, the financial cost of his single appearance becomes an absolutely sickening, terrifying statistic for the billionaire owners. The investigative journalists aggressively compared his heavily inflated bank accounts to the relatively modest, hard-earned contracts of the fierce, battle-tested veterans who were actually delivering historic championship banners to their respective, desperate cities. The glaring contrast was absolutely infuriating to the deeply loyal, hard-working fans who paid premium, exorbitant prices for their stadium seats. Everyone in the national media fiercely assumed that a man who had secured such unearned, monumental wealth without the physical grind would rapidly spiral completely out of control. They firmly expected him to blindly throw his millions into terrible, predatory investments and dark schemes until absolutely nothing was left in his massive accounts. But if you look closely at the heavily guarded, highly confidential documents from the Federal Tax Services, a completely different, incredibly shocking financial reality suddenly emerges. The deeply fascinating, often tragic psychology of a fallen sports idol usually dictates a loud, incredibly messy, and highly visible public downfall. The devoted television audience is entirely accustomed to seeing broken, rejected athletes desperately clinging to the fading spotlight, making deeply embarrassing television appearances, or violently colliding with the strict, unforgiving boundaries of the law. But the exact moment the heavy gymnasium doors permanently closed behind Pervis Ellison in the early 2000s, he executed an incredibly rare, highly suspicious maneuver that baffled his fiercest critics. He completely, silently vanished from the aggressive, highly invasive radar of the national press. According to the meticulously kept, highly detailed archives of police blotters and public court records from that specific decade, there was an absolute, completely deafening silence surrounding his name. There were absolutely no scandalous late-night arrests, no bitter, protracted lawsuits over unpaid gambling debts, and absolutely no leaked, devastating stories sold to the hungry tabloid magazines. Why would a wealthy man who had lived his entire adult life under the blinding, suffocating microscope of the national sports media suddenly evaporate into thin air? Based on the highly detailed regional real estate registries and property tax records, the investigative trail quietly leads directly to a secluded, highly affluent neighborhood nestled deeply in the state of New Jersey. He actively sought absolute, impenetrable peace, deliberately and aggressively isolating his family far away from the toxic, mocking whispers of the professional basketball fraternity. The aggressive, deeply cynical reporters spent years desperately trying to dig up fresh, humiliating dirt on the man they still viciously called out-of-service Pervis, desperately hoping to catch him in a deeply compromising, financially ruinous situation. But the massive, incredibly shocking secret he was quietly building in the absolute shadows of his former glory completely stunned the entire sports community when it finally surfaced in the year 2014. For over a decade, the professional sports world firmly believed that Pervis Ellison was simply hiding in absolute shame, heavily burdened by the devastating multi-million-dollar collapse of his highly anticipated basketball career. But the deeply investigative journalists who finally tracked him down in the quiet, affluent suburbs of New Jersey uncovered a completely unexpected, highly guarded secret that completely flipped the entire narrative upside down. According to the meticulously filed local educational reports from that specific region, precisely in the year 2014, the infamous former #1 overall draft pick quietly accepted a remarkably modest position as a youth track and basketball coach at the Life Center Academy. And right here, a massive, incredibly fascinating psychological question immediately emerges from the dark shadows. Why would a man who had already secured over $17 million guaranteed dollars willingly return to the squeaking hardwood of a tiny, relatively unknown high school gymnasium far away from the blinding television cameras? Based on the deeply revealing, highly emotional interviews given by his young, heavily inspired teenage players and subsequently published in the regional press of that era, Pervis Ellison was fiercely dedicated to actively preventing the next generation from repeating his own catastrophic professional nightmares. The local reporters vividly noted in their weekly newspaper columns that he strictly warned the young athletes about the incredibly dark, highly toxic side of instant athletic fame and massive, unearned wealth. He was not just teaching them how to properly execute a simple offensive play. He was desperately trying to save their fragile futures from the incredibly ruthless corporate machinery that had completely chewed up his own physical body. He successfully transformed his deeply humiliating, highly publicized professional failure into a powerful, completely unexpected shield for those innocent kids. And while he successfully reinvented his shattered life far away from the aggressive sports media, the absolute biggest, most highly debated question that has viciously haunted basketball historians for decades still stubbornly demands a definitive answer. When the modern television networks furiously debate the absolute worst, most financially disastrous investments in the long, complicated history of professional sports, the controversial name of Pervis Ellison is always aggressively dragged directly back into the harsh, unforgiving spotlight. According to the massive, highly publicized historical rankings continuously updated by the largest national sports media conglomerates, he permanently occupies a deeply unfortunate, heavily debated position near the very top of the biggest draft disappointments of all time. But is this incredibly heavy, deeply permanent public branding actually fair to a man whose physical foundation simply crumbled beneath the immense weight of corporate expectations? In the extensive, deeply analytical medical reports currently published by modern specialized orthopedic clinics, the doctors clearly detail massive, revolutionary advancements in joint preservation and load management that simply did not exist in the early 1990s. And this specific, highly documented medical fact immediately and completely changes the entire context of our investigation. If the Sacramento front office had actually possessed the highly advanced, cutting-edge medical technology of today, could they have easily saved his magnificent career and permanently protected their massive, multi-million-dollar investment? It is entirely possible that the deeply tragic, highly controversial saga of Nervous Pervis was not a calculated, malicious financial scam perpetrated by a lazy athlete, but rather a devastating, unavoidable collision between incredibly fragile human genetics and the absolute, unforgiving brutality of a completely unyielding professional sports schedule. The fiercely loyal fans fiercely demanded a flawless, unbreakable superhero, and the greedy corporate executives willingly sold them a beautiful, highly expensive illusion. Ultimately, the deeply cautionary tale of Pervis Ellison serves as the ultimate, chilling warning to every single billionaire owner who blindly prepares to write a massive, life-altering check for the next supposed savior of their franchise. The heavily guarded medical secrets hiding deep inside a young athlete's knees will absolutely always dictate the harsh reality, completely regardless of the magnificent, blinding media hype.